Hello! Welcome to part 2 of me reviewing each of the 52 books that I read last year in 2021. If you haven't yet watched part 1, in which I discussed the first 26 books that I read in 2021, I'm going to link that video up in the cards as well as down in the description box below. Part 2 is dedicated to the remaining 26 books that I ended up reading in 2021. It's gonna be a long video, there's a lot to cover, so without any further ado, let's get it! Okay, so I've opened up my STORYGRAPH, and I believe yesterday we left off at The Turn of the Screw by Henry James as the 26th book that I had read. The next book that I read was We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, and I gave that book 4.5 stars. Personally, I enjoyed We Have Always Lived in the Castle more than I enjoyed The Haunting of Hill House. So the novel is about two sisters, Constance and Mary Cat. Mary Cat is the younger of the two. She has like an affinity for witchcraft. She believes a lot in things like omens and talismans and things of the sort, and so she's a very sort of strange and unlikable figure in town. Constance, the older sister, on the other hand, is very beautiful and gentle and kind and universally beloved, except for the fact that she's extremely agoraphobic. She refuses to leave the house, and there is a rumor floating around town that Constance poisoned the entire rest of her family, with the exception of her and Mary Cat. But the sort of inciting incident of the story is that a really charming and handsome cousin shows up to their house in order to try and court and marry Constance. And the disruption caused by this new arrival is what We Have Always Lived in the Castle is really about. It is very much so a feminist text. At its core, it is a book about the ways in which patriarchy allows men to just take and take and take from women, while women are just forced to give with no expectation of receiving anything in return. And while Constance has been conditioned by society to be a perpetual giver, Mary Cat, because she hasn't quite been brainwashed by societal expectations for what people expect of each gender, she's the person who initially very insistently kind of pushes back on the intrusion of a man into this formerly female-only space of their house. Because Uncle Julian is there, but he has been so sort of robbed of masculine power and energy by his poisoning that he isn't able to exert a huge force of will over the house. And so when Cousin Charles shows up in this house that is now dominated by these two women and attempts to sort of re-exert patriarchal control, that's really what the story is about, and the ways in which Constance and Mary Cat kind of try and either capitulate to that control or resist it. It's a stunning book. It's incredibly well written. Shirley Jackson does claustrophobia and agoraphobia really well, which makes sense because unfortunately towards the end of her life she herself kind of had a bit of a breakdown and became severely agoraphobic. I think if you enjoy female-led narratives, I think if you enjoy unsettling horror, not supernatural horror, but more just the horror of human society as a whole, I think you will really like We Have Always Lived in the Castle. And by the way, if you have read the works of Shirley Jackson and you have other recommendations for writers like her or works like her, please leave them down below because I genuinely enjoyed her work so much, and I'm really keen to explore other books in the same genre, kind of addressing maybe similar themes. Okay, the next book I read, and this was actually a reread because I read this book when I was really young, when I was a teenager, and I wanted to read it again now as an adult to see how it held up. It was Fahrenheit 451 by Bradbury. It sits up there with 1984 by George Orwell and Brave New World by Aldous Huxley as one of the cornerstones of dystopian fiction. The title, Fahrenheit 451, is an allusion to the temperature at which paper burns. And the novel is set in a future society in which firemen are men who are tasked with burning books. And our narrator, the protagonist, is a guy called Montague who is one of these firemen, and he basically has an encounter with the children of one of his neighbors that ends up kind of changing his life. So this is one of the books that I did actually write a short little STORYGRAPH review for, and I think maybe I'll just read it. On STORYGRAPH, I wrote, "Incredible writing and surprisingly relevant to this day. When Montague was talking about how people always had little earpieces in, blasting talk shows or radio shows or music, because every moment must always be filled with noise, I became acutely aware of my own tendency to always have Bluetooth earbuds in and be listening to something. A podcast, an audiobook, a video, ambient noise, music, etc. And so I took them out so that I could just be with the book. Wasn't the biggest fan of the way Bradbury tried to blame censorship partially on minorities. He used examples of dog lovers versus cat lovers complaining, but let's be real, he meant racial and gender minorities, etc., which is an odd take given the way our voices have been the ones historically censored through oppression. Ray Bradbury basically tries to take the example of women and racial minorities, pointing out that like certain language is maybe like harmful and shouldn't be used, and or that like certain texts are problematic and should have their problematic nature like acknowledged. He takes that sort of position and then takes it to like some weird crazy logical extreme where he's like, they started banning books and they're the reason to blame for censorship in our society, which is honestly like such a weird fucking take, because literally for the past like couple of days, weeks, months, all I have been reading about is the way in which like racists are banning any and all texts that discuss race, especially critical race theory, from being discussed in the school curriculum. A school board also just banned the graphic novel Mouse, which is a seminal text in the terms of discussing like anti-Semitism. Like women and racial minorities are not out here like championing censorship. All the censorship that I've seen is coming from like white people who are very afraid to discuss race or gender or anything which will like disrupt white male hegemonic power. So I just feel like that was a weird take for Ray Bradbury, both in his own time and honestly even in our time. I feel like it was very like, what the fuck? But, and as I state in this review, the rest of the book made so many excellent points in beautiful language that I will give this old dead white dude a pass and rate the novel a 4.25 out of 5 anyway. The next book that I read in 2021 was Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe by Benjamin Alire Saenz. I rated this book 4.75 stars. I actually read this book with my entire friend group. Like we did it as a sort of like a buddy read book club sort of a situation. So this is actually a young adult novel. It is about two teenagers, Aristotle and Dante, both of whom are Mexican American, and this novel sort of follows the course of their friendships over their childhood into their teenage years, along with the realization that they are both of them gay and actually in love with each other. And it is one of those books that I am just so relieved exists in the world nowadays, because it's one of those books I really wish had existed when I was a teenager. And the friend group that I read this book with, none of us are straight. And all of us, we had our hearts melted by this story. We were so touched. And it was like a sentiment echoed by basically everyone in the group where it was like, man, like this is such a cute and beautiful little story. Like I wish we had had this when we were growing up. Now, just this past year, the author actually came out with a sequel to this novel, and none of us have actually read it yet, but I'm hoping that in 2022 we like reform OAGC book club to read the sequel. So the next book that I read in 2021 was Naturally Tan by Tan France. So Tan France is a British Pakistani stylist, and he's most famous for being featured on the show Queer Eye. I have a deep and undying love for that show. Honestly, like the Fab Five, they are my emotional support gays. Every time I watch an episode of Queer Eye, I'm like, it is such a serotonin boost. I feel lighter and freer and like I'm gonna turn my entire life around. When I made that like really drastic jump from long hair to a pixie for the first time in like September of 2018, I did that in part because I had like binge watched the entire first season of Queer Eye, and I was like, let me get my shit together, let me do like a little makeover, let me like turn my life around. But yeah, the point is, I love the Fab Five. They have had like a genuine impact on my actual life, and I've always kind of felt a deep affinity with Tan because we're both like South Asian American and queer, and that is always like such a struggle to have to deal with. So when I found out that like Tan had a memoir, I was like, oh, let me read this shit like right now. As far as memoirs go, did it like blow my mind? No. But were there still a lot of moments that were emotionally really resonant with me and which like really touched me and which I thought were incredibly enjoyable and beautiful to read? Yes. Additionally, I did listen to this as an audiobook, and I think that really helped boost my enjoyment of this memoir because it was lovely to be able to hear Tan's words in his own voice. I think if you like Queer Eye, I think if you like Tan as a general person, I think this memoir is an excellent read, but it didn't like blow me away the way that I'm Telling the Truth But I'm Lying by Bossy Ikpi did. Okay, so the next book that I read was Memorial by Bryan Washington, and I really enjoyed this book. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. It's a story of a gay couple, Mike, who's Japanese American, and Benson, who's African American. Their relationship is kind of falling apart. One day, Mike finds out that his father, who he's kind of like estranged from and who lives back in Japan, is dying. And so he drops everything and he flies back to Japan. At the same time that his mother, Mitsuko, flies from Japan to Houston to visit Mike. So now, Mike's in Japan, trying to reconcile his strained relationship with his dying father, and Benson is in Houston, sharing an apartment with Mike's Japanese mom, who doesn't speak a lot of English, and who doesn't really seem to like Benson at all. And the story is told kind of in rotating perspectives. Sometimes Benson is the narrator, sometimes Mike is the narrator. Like, at its core, you know, Memorial is about two guys who are both kind of like lost. They're kind of in a rut, they're kind of stuck, but they are still clinging on to each other because they're all each other knows, and neither of them is willing to really like expend the energy and put in the work to try and move themselves out of the rut onwards with their lives. And so the book is really about them kind of coming to terms with and being honest about who they are in their relationships, what do they actually like want out of their lives, what is significant to them, are they still on the same page, does it make sense for these two men to still be in a relationship, or do they need to actually go their separate ways and like move on with their lives. The thing that really struck me about Memorial, the reason why I rated it so highly, is that it's not just about this like disintegrating relationship, it is also a novel about parents. Because while Mike is obviously having this whole bullshit going on with his estranged father dying, Benson also has a very strained and terrible relationship with his family, and he's trying to figure all of that out while also dealing with the maternal figure of Mitsuko living in his house. There's a lot in this book about like, are parents redeemable? How do you like hold them responsible for the damage that they've caused? At what point do you as a child decide to either let go of the damage and forgive them, or to like cut them out of your lives entirely? I'm so excited that like Bryan Washington exists as an author. I'm gonna read like anything he ever puts out in the future. Okay, so the next book I read was Stamped: Racism, Antiracism, and You by Ibram X. Kendi and Jason Reynolds. So Ibram X. Kendi wrote a very thick, really informative, intensely good nonfiction book called Stamped from the Beginning. And I read the book in 2020. I really enjoyed it, but like, let's be real, like that book is a chunker. Not everybody has the time to be reading a book that thick. I did, because we were all in lockdown. But I understand that that is a very like hefty and heavy book to get through, and that like not everybody necessarily has the time to read it. And that's why when I heard about Stamped: Racism, Antiracism, and You, I got very excited, because what this book basically is that Jason Reynolds has taken Ibram X. Kendi's thick-ass nonfiction book meant for adults, and he has turned it into a much shorter, more palatable, and easy to understand work intended for a young adult audience. I picked up this book to read for two reasons. One, I wanted like a refresher of all of the ideas that existed in Stamped from the beginning. Two, I was kind of curious to see like how well Jason Reynolds was going to be able to explain Ibram X. Kendi's very complex ideas in Stamped from the Beginning. And I gotta say, this book does an incredible job. If you want to read Stamped from the Beginning but you haven't gotten around to it, or you tried and you felt like the text was too academic or difficult or whatever other reason, I think reading Stamped: Racism, Antiracism, and You is an excellent way to like begin engaging with Ibram X. Kendi's ideas. The next book I read was When No One Is Watching by Alyssa, a thriller that is also like, I guess, an allegory for gentrification. I really enjoyed this book. I gave it a 4.75 stars, which means that of all of the thrillers that I read this year, it was what I considered to be the absolute best thriller. And when it comes to thrillers, like here's what I'm looking for out of a good thriller. I want to have a good time reading it. I want it to be like really gripping. I want to keep turning the pages. And I also want to feel tense and uncomfortable and then feel a sense of catharsis. Lastly, and this is what like pushes a thriller over the top from being just good to being great, I need the thriller to like explore some really good, juicy themes. And When No One Was Watching, it does all of that. Now I know there are like some reviewers who were saying that like When No One Was Watching isn't like tense or scary, and there's actually an excellent video by Jessie over at Bow Ties and Books that talks about this phenomena of a lot of like white reviewers not recognizing the sort of like really uncomfortable and tense and scary elements in thriller and horror narratives by people of color. I'm gonna link that book up in the cards because Jessie does a much better job of explaining my feelings about people who thought like When No One Was Watching wasn't scary or tense. For me, the novel was plenty tense. For those of you who've read it, that scene in the Uber, sphincter tightening for me. Like every single muscle in my body was tense the entire time. This book took me on an emotional roller coaster. I was like so tense at some moments. I was like, damn, did I like pull a muscle in my back? Like what is going on? But thankfully for me, like the ending gave me just like a huge sense of catharsis. Like I felt like I could just like let go and relax and be like, whew, okay, we good. And so for me, truly, this book, like it hit all of the marks. If you are looking for a thriller that engages with some like really interesting and sort of heavy themes while still maintaining a lot of the sort of fun thrillery aspects of it, I think you should definitely pick up When No One Is Watching. When No One Was Watching was like so effective as a thriller for me that I entered into like a thriller phase. I was like, I want to read thrillers and nothing else. And so I started looking up like what books people recommended as being really, really good thrillers. So the next book that I picked up after When No One Was Watching was The Maidens by Alex Michaelides. And this book, it was honestly like such a letdown. And I think part of that is because the pitch of the novel is so different from what the novel actually is. The pitch of the novel is that a young female student at Cambridge University gets murdered, and she's part of this group of young, beautiful female undergrads called the Maidens. And the Maidens are led by this like classics professor who is potentially sinister. Maybe he had something to do with the murder of his student. And the protagonist of the novel, Mariana, is a group therapist, and her niece was really good friends with the murdered girl. Additionally, Mariana herself is an alumna of Cambridge University. So when the murder happens, her niece, Zoe, like calls Mariana up and is like, please come, like my friend's been murdered, I need you here for comfort, blah, 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 whatever. And when Mariana shows up, she feels like something is off, she feels like something is hinky, and so she basically like inserts herself into the investigation to try and figure out like what's really going on with this professor, what is really going on with these murders, and how are the Maidens involved. So that is how the story is pitched to you. On top of that, the book itself is called The Maidens. So the perception that I had going into this book, and it wasn't just me, like a lot of other people had this perception going into the book, is that this book was going to be like really heavily centered around the Maidens. I think all of us assume that because Mariana is a group therapist, she's basically going to try and like be the group therapist for the group of the Maidens, and that the story is really going to be centered around the Maidens themselves and the sort of like messy, tense inner workings and group dynamics of the Maidens. And that is not what the story is at all. I cannot even remember any of the Maidens' names because they are such unmemorable characters who feature so minimally in this entire story. I felt like I was like juked. I felt like I was hoodwinked, scammed, bamboozled, led astray. I was like, what is this story? Like, this is not what I was promised. And even once I was like, okay, fine. The Maidens are like not actually going to be an important part of the story. Let me actually try and solve this mystery and see what the hell is going on. The reveal at the end was so like, what the fuck? It didn't make any sense. And the story basically ends with the protagonist feeling great anger and blaming the victim of like statutory assault and like child grooming for like all of her problems. That ending did not sit right with me. It was very much so one of those situations where I was like, a woman may be the protagonist of this novel, but this novel was definitely fucking written by a man. It was bad, y'all. It was bad. But a bunch of people who reviewed The Maidens were saying that like, oh, The Maidens is not as good as The Silent Patient. Like Alex Michaelides' first book, The Silent Patient, that's the better thriller. So after finishing The Maidens, the next book that I did read was The Silent Patient. I did like it a lot better than I liked The Maiden. I gave The Maidens 3 stars. I gave The Silent Patient 3.75 stars. It was a lot more effective for me. I actually like, I felt gut. You know? I definitely had that like frisson of excitement that you get when you realize like the rug's been pulled out from under you and not everything is as it seems. And I feel like That's kind of like what a lot of people go to thrillers for. So in that sense, I think The Silent Patient was much more effective. So The Silent Patient is basically told from the perspective of a male narrator, Theo. He's like a therapist. He has a patient who is very, very famous. And the reason why she's really, really famous is because she was like an artist who ended up murdering her husband. No one knows why. Like after the murder happened, she basically like clammed up and didn't talk throughout her entire trial. So much so that I think they like declared her mentally incapable of standing trial, and they chose to put her in this like psych facility instead of in a prison. And once she was in the psych facility, everybody was like, oh, okay, she was just being quiet in order to plead insanity. She's gonna start talking now. But it's been literal years and she still is not talking. And so Theo, the therapist, his job is basically to try and get her to communicate somehow. So that is the premise of The Silent Patient. That's all I'm really gonna tell you. I think it's a good time. I think if you like read it in one sitting in an afternoon, you won't be like, damn, that was a waste of my life. I think you'll be like, okay, not bad, decently done. That was a fun ride. And then you'll put it away and never think about it again. So the next book that I read, and I gave this book 5 stars because of nostalgia, because this book is a reread, because I've read this book hundreds of times, because I have deep affection for the movie adaptation. It's Matilda by Roald Dahl. This was like in the dead of summer. I was like job hunting. I was feeling very blah and terrible and lost in life, and I wanted something comfortable to read, and so I reread Matilda, and it perked me up. It did the trick. It still deserves 5 stars. It like holds up after all of this time. If you've never watched Matilda or read Matilda, what are you doing? The entire cast of that movie is iconic. It is like a Hallmark movie of my childhood. I quote it all the time. Miss Trunchbull used to like haunt my nightmares. If you haven't watched Matilda, honestly, I give you permission to click off of this video and go watch Matilda right now. Like, fuck me and what I'm saying. Go watch Matilda. Next book on the list is Speaking of Summer by Kalisha Buckhanon. This was another one of the books that I picked up when I was kind of like on my thriller binge. So the story follows a pair of twins, Autumn and Summer. Autumn and Summer live together, and one night in the like middle of winter on a very snowy evening, Autumn climbs up to the rooftop of their Harlem apartment and just disappears. There's only one set of footprints like going out to the edge of the building. There's no other footprints anywhere else. There's no body anywhere. Like Summer has just disappeared. I just realized I think I accidentally insinuated that Autumn is the one who disappears. No. Summer is the one who like disappears into nowhere, and Autumn is like left behind trying to figure out like where the hell Summer went. As a black woman reporting that another black woman is missing, like no one's taking her seriously, the cops aren't investigating properly, and this entire story is basically about us trying to figure out, alongside Autumn, what happened to Summer. I gave this the exact same rating that I gave The Silent Patient, even though they're two very different types of thrillers, right? Like The Silent Patient is, I think, a much more like traditional boilerplate thriller, whereas Speaking of Summer has this sort of like quiet, tense anxiety like running throughout the entire thing. So very interesting book, well written, definitely hit the spot as a thriller, did not knock my socks off the way When No One Was Watching did, but definitely one of the better thrillers I read during 2021. So the next 2 books that I read are by the same author, Alexander McCall Smith, and like Matilda, they were these nostalgia rereads. I was looking for comfort and familiarity in things. And so the 2 books that I picked up to read are the first and second books in the #1 Ladies Detective Agency series by Alexander McCall Smith. So the first book is called The #1 Ladies Detective Agency. The second book is called Tears of the Giraffe. And Alexander McCall Smith is like a Scottish writer, but he spent a lot of time in Africa, in Botswana specifically. And so he wrote The #1 Ladies Detective Agency as a series taking place in Botswana with Botswana's first ever lady detective, Precious Ramotswe. So the first novel is basically about Ma Ramotswe like making the decision to create a detective agency, hiring like a secretary, trying to like gain a clientele and cases. And the format of these novels is that usually like each chapter is about a specific case, but then there's also like one broader overarching case that's being solved throughout the entire novel. And when I was young, like in my like early teens, I loved these novels. I binged through them. I think I read like all of them that had come out up to that particular point in time. And I did rate them favorably because from a purely like narrative standpoint and also from like a nostalgia standpoint, they are fun little detective stories, and they did make me feel like warm and fuzzy and comforted the way that they did when I was a teenager. And that's why I gave the first book 3.75 stars and the second book 3.5 stars. But this is unfortunately a book series which I think becoming an adult and learning more about post-colonialism has kind of ruined for me. Because when I was a teenager, just sort of like mindlessly reading these books with no real idea of who Alexander McCall Smith was, I assumed Alexander McCall Smith was like a native Botswanan writing about his own country. And so as an adult, to read these novels and realize that actually like he's a Scottish man who's writing a series of novels from the perspective of a Black African woman, it's definitely kind of messy and a little bit problematic, especially once you start looking at these statements that Mara Motsue's character makes about Africa as a whole and Botswana and South Africans and Zimbabweans, and you realize that it's actually the opinions of a white Scottish man coming out through this ostensibly Black female character. And once I started to kind of take that series apart from that sort of post-colonial lens, which I will always do, right? I am a post-colonial subject, and so whether I want to or not, whenever I'm reading a thing, like the lens through which I am seeing it is always a post-colonial lens. And it definitely made reading the series like a little bit uncomfortable, and it's one of the reasons why I read the first 2 novels and then I just kind of stopped, because I realized that the discomfort that that caused was greater than the perceived nostalgic comfort that the series would have given me had I kept on going. Oh my god, it's snowing. Hope it doesn't get like super dark really soon. So the next book on the list, I actually loved it so much, I went out and I bought the book. First off, because the cover of it, stunning, beautiful, incredible. But secondly, and more importantly, I gave this book 5 stars. And the book in question is Honey Girl by Morgan Rogers. Morgan Rogers is a queer Black woman, and Honey Girl is actually her debut novel. A bunch of people marketed this novel as a romance because the initial premise of the story seems like it would be a romance, right? The main character, the woman on the cover, the Honey Girl in question, is Grace Porter, and she has just completed her PhD in astrophysics, and in order to celebrate, she and her besties go on a girls' trip to Vegas. While in Vegas, she gets hella drunk and she wakes up married to a complete stranger whose name she doesn't even really know. Grace lives on the West Coast in Portland, and she eventually figures out that the woman that she married in Vegas is a Japanese-American girl called Yuki who lives all the way in New York City. And my assumption that this was just going to be a fun, cute little sapphic rom-com is the reason why I picked this up in the first place, because I was, once again, at a very lost phase in my life, and I was just looking for like comforting and easy reads. And this book fucked me all the way up because, yes, while there is a romantic through line to this story, it is not a romance. Like, I don't know how to explain this to you. It is the coming of age novel that all of us like queer millennials struggling in our 20s like needed to experience, because yeah, like Grace and Yuki are really, really cute, but the real heart of the story is like Grace. It is the way in which she is just like lost as hell, and she has spent her entire life trying to like impress her parents and just be good enough. She wants to be good enough for her father's approval. She wants to be good enough for her mother's love. She wants to be good enough for society as a whole, because she's a queer Black woman in the hella white field of astronomy, and that's so hard to navigate. Everyone at every turn is constantly telling her like she is not enough, she's not good enough, she's not a good fit for the culture of the company or the culture of the university, and she's carrying like the pressure of all of these expectations on her back and like trying not to fucking break. And everything about her character felt so raw and so real and so applicable to where I was in life at the exact moment that I was reading this book. And it feels like such a beautiful gift from the universe that this book fell into my lap at exactly the right moment in time, because I needed to read it, and I needed to see like Grace overcome her shit so that I could experience catharsis and have hope that I could one day overcome my shit as well. And the way in which like Grace mends all of her family relationships, she learns to forgive herself, she learns to forgive her parents, she like gets a direction in life, she starts making her own choices. I'm just like, yes, okay. And this book, like, I credit this book for having gotten me out of like the terrible headspace that I was in the summer of 2021. I feel like I was having like a genuine life crisis, and Morgan Rogers just like knocked on my door and threw this book in my face and was like, get it together, ma'am. And I fucking did. Like, I really did, because of this book. And for me, this deserves a place on my shelf. It deserves every last one of the 5 stars that I gave it. Now, if I could just like go to Vegas, get really drunk, and get married to a cute girl who actually happens to be my soulmate, would love that for me. Universe, please do your thing. Okay, so after I managed to like pull myself out of an existential quarter-life crisis, the next book that I read was Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. And I rated this book 4 stars. This is like a science fiction book, and basically what's happened is like the southeastern part of the United States has been like taken over by some mysterious force. And so every year, in order to understand like what the hell is happening in the southeastern part of the United States, they end up sending like groups of explorers into this like closed off area to try and figure out what the hell is going on, to kind of like make observations, see what's happening, write diary entries, and report back. Now this book follows a group of those explorers, and it's narrated by one of those explorers. I think she's like a biologist, and her specialty is transitional environments. So you know how like different biomes exist. As you like travel through land and these biomes transition from one to the other, like a forested area transitions into a swamp, which eventually transitions into the ocean, they create these sort of liminal, transitional, in-between environments. And those environments are what the narrator specializes in. And so because the environment in the southeastern part of the United States has begun like drastically changing because of this like random unseen force that has like shown up, she's been chosen to like go in and make observations about the environment. You're not going to get answers in this novel. Now granted, this novel is the first of 3 books, but like I don't feel compelled to read the other 2 books. At its core, Annihilation is really a character study. It's not about Area X. It's about the people going into Area X and the ways in which they relate to each other and to the environment around them. And so reading the book on that thematic and character-based level, I think that is where you will get like the most out of Annihilation. That's how I got a lot out of Annihilation. Like the narrator, she says, there are certain kinds of deaths that one should not be expected to relive. Certain kinds of connections so deep that when they are broken, you feel the snap of the link inside you. This is really a novel about grief and loss, and how as you like build experiences and connect with people and go through life, those experiences and those new connections so thoroughly shape you as a person that they transform who you are. And then once you are this new person who you have become, based off of all of these like new connections you have built that have changed you, if one of those connections that you have built to a person, if one of those relationships is suddenly fractured by loss, you experience annihilation. You can no longer continue to be the person that you used to be before you experienced this loss. The old you is gone, you are transitioning into somebody new. And so really, the sci-fi element, it's just there to sort of strengthen the metaphor of change, to make it so that instead of it just being like a metaphorical or philosophical change, there is actually like a physical, biological, potentially alien influence change happening to the people inside these stories. So I really, really enjoyed this novel. Annihilation is probably my favorite kind of sci-fi, where it's not like a hard system of magic and really intense world building. It's more the use of sci-fi to like explore interesting and intense emotional themes. I think if you're like crazy into sci-fi, then the Southern Reach trilogy, like it probably is like not for you, because you don't really get a lot of answers to the sort of like burning questions you would have as a sci-fi reader on how this like world works. Okay, the next book that I read was My Sister, the Serial Killer by Oyinkan Braithwaite, and I gave this book 4.25 stars. This book was such a joy. I read this book, finished it, and then I immediately started back up and read it again. So Oyinkan Braithwaite is a Nigerian and British author. My Sister, the Serial Killer is predictably about a pair of sisters. So Korede, the older sister, is a nurse. She's kind of like plain looking, a little bit overlooked, and she's constantly running around after her younger sister, Iola, cleaning up all of her messes. Because Iola is devastatingly beautiful, and she knows it, and she uses it to get whatever the hell she wants. She's their parents' favorite child, she has all sorts of different boyfriends, and Korede is basically classic older sister trying to make sure that Iola's not getting into trouble. The book opens with Iola having killed a boyfriend out of self-defense for the second time and calling Korede for help to clean up the body, and with Korede having to kind of grapple with the fact that, okay, killing one boyfriend in self-defense because you're saying he attacked you, that's plausible and believable. But the odds of it happening again, was my sister really attacked by her boyfriend, or is she actually a serial killer. I think Oyekan Braithwaite is a master of good character work because this book is short. I read it in one sitting. The individual chapters are also very, very short. And yet, every single chapter, it hits. It packs a punch. Despite being a very, very short novel, you have a full sense of all of the different characters in My Sister the Serial Killer. In addition to being this like tense, is my sister a serial killer thriller type of a situation, the book manages to be incredibly funny. And it also manages to be like a family drama, because at its core, it's really about these two sisters and their relationship to each other, and how Korede feels like she has been overlooked and Iola gets everything she wants, but at the same time, she's an older sister who feels this immense need and also an obligation, because there's an expectation from her family to always look after and take care of her younger sister. There was so much going on in this incredibly short novel. Every time I would finish reading a chapter, I would like go right back to the start and read it again to mine it for like more juice and content, and I am eagerly looking forward to any and everything Oyekan Braithwaite writes. Now, I will say, this book is written by a Nigerian woman for Nigerian women. Every once in a while, we get some like words or phrases or dialogue that is like not translated into the novel, but translations were easy enough to find, and it absolutely did not ruin my enjoyment of this novel at all. So, highly recommend My Sister the Serial Killer if you are in the mood for a light thriller mystery family drama situation. So the next novel that I read was The Confessions of Frannie Langton, which I rated 3.75 stars. So this is like a sapphic sort of mystery story. So Frannie Langton is a Black woman in the Caribbean who works as a servant in the UK, and she's on trial for murdering the woman of the house, like the lady that she waits on. And the premise of this novel is that like as she's awaiting trial, she sits down to write her confessions, so to speak, where she basically talks about like who she is and how she got here. This is one of the few books that I did actually write a blurb on the STORYGRAPH for, so let me just read that for you and then you can make your own assumptions from my impressions of the novel. 3.75 stars. Well written and an excellent work of historical fiction. But if you hate frustrating protagonists who make frustrating decisions that make you want to shake some sense into them, maybe avoid this one. Frannie willfully ignores every single piece of good advice that other women in her social class who have shared life experience and wisdom have ever given to her. So this includes characters like Phoeba, Sal, and Prue. She ignores their good advice to go chasing after some white woman who honestly barely seems to care about Frannie, and it made me want to scream out of frustration at least 30 times while reading. Sal saying she was done hearing Frannie blabber about her white woman was the most relatable feeling in the entire novel. So those are my thoughts on The Confession of Frannie Langton. The next novel, which I also rated a 3.75, was Lakewood by Megan Giddings. This is like a science fiction / horror story that's like not really very science fiction-y at all, because it's based on a very, very real history of medical experimentation on Black people in the United States of America. And I think part of the reason why I ended up like not rating this book higher than it did is because honestly it was like a little bit too effective at the story that it was telling, in that because these are like experiments on the body, there were a couple moments of body horror, like especially one involving teeth, which like really freaked me out. They really unsettled me. I was like having nightmares about it for like days and days and days. I guess in that sense it's like Megan Giddings, like you did a really, really good job at the horror aspect of this novel, but I was genuinely so sort of like traumatized by some of the shit going on in here that I felt like in good conscience I could not give this book more than a 3.75 stars because it was a harrowing book to read. And some of the like pills that they end up giving Lena, they like affect her psychologically, and so as the story progresses and she's getting like mentally and psychologically altered by these pills, the writing style actually begins to change to reflect the sort of like hazy, unreal, hallucinogenic quality of like Lena's mental state. So I think Megan Giddings did like a masterful job. This is definitely like a very eerie, creepy horror novel that gets a lot of its horror from the fact that like these types of things happened in real life. Okay, next up on the list we have Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens, which I rated 4.25 stars. I don't actually want to talk about Dombey and Son a lot here because I read Dombey and Son as part of like a challenge that I set for myself to read the works of Charles Dickens and Leo Tolstoy. And I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make like a video about the challenge as a whole, just in case people want to know about it or people want to join me. And then I'm gonna make a separate video kind of reviewing Dombey and Son alongside the Leo Tolstoy book that I'm currently in the middle of reading. to fulfill the challenge prompt that I set for myself, which is to basically read like an underrated novel that not many people know by both Charles Dickens and Leo Tolstoy. And Dombey and Son, despite the name, is neither about Mr. Dombey nor about his son. It's actually about Dombey's daughter. And it's honestly probably like the most feminist of all of Dickens's works, because at its core it's about the ways in which Victorian society completely devalues daughters and actually women as a whole and the positions that they occupy in society. Dombey and Son was hella long, but it was also hella entertaining. And the length, which was like 1,000 pages, it was mitigated by the fact that I actually didn't read this book as a physical book. I read it on my e-reader, and even then I only like read words on a page for maybe like 20% of the time. The remaining 80% of the time I listened to this book as an audiobook. The audiobook's actually completely available for free on YouTube. I'm gonna link it up in the cards. The narrator, Mill Nicholson, she does such an excellent job. For the first time in my life, I was able to understand people who talk about how Charles Dickens is such a funny writer because I was listening to Mill Nicholson's audiobooks. She has a way of infusing humor and wit and sarcasm and emotion at exactly the right moments so that you get a very clear sense of like what is going on in the story. And Dombey and Son is the book that made me discover that like Victorian literature is actually a genre of book that I can totally listen to on audiobook and have a great time. Okay, so the next 3 books that I read after Dombey and Son were the Brown Sisters trilogy by Talia Hibbert, which I actually have all 3 books right here. So we have Get a Life, Chloe Brown, which I rated 4.25 stars, and then Take a Hint, Dani Brown, and Act Your Age, Evie Brown, which I rated both of these 4.75 stars. So the thing with all 3 of these stories is that in addition to being romances, they're also about like our female protagonists like figuring shit out about themselves. And the reason why I rated Get a Life, Chloe Brown a little bit lower than I did Take a Hint, Dani Brown, and I just realized this door is open, Act Your Age, Evie Brown, is that I just feel like I could relate to the things that Dani and Eve had to realize a lot more than I could to the things that like Chloe had to realize. Dani's sort of anxieties about academia, about being alone, being a workaholic, being like too ambitious and intense of a person to ever like succeed in a relationship, as well as her drive to like make a name for herself and be known in her field. Like big mood, Dani, like big fucking mood. And then Eve's sense of like confusion and being lost at life and like not really knowing what her like niche is and trying to figure out like where she fits in this world, where she fits in next to her own sisters, what are the things that she's good at, what things make her happy, like what career path, what life path like does she want to walk down on. That was like the 2021 mood for me big time. And so the sort of like thematic aspects of the female protagonist's journeys in these 2 stories like really resonated with me over Chloe Brown. I will say as like purely a romance, my fave was Take a Hint, Dani Brown, because like I stan Dani as a bisexual queen. I love Zaph as a character. I think they're so well suited for each other. And I just have like so much genuine love for this book. I have so much love for this entire series as a whole because I don't really love very many romance novels. And these books just completely disabused me of the notion that romance is a genre just filled with like straight white people. And after I finished reading the entire trilogy and I was reflecting on my experience of reading these, I realized like I want to read these books again. I think they are warm and comforting and funny and delightful and absolutely the kind of book that I would reach for when I'm just like feeling kind of down and I want to cheer myself up. I'm very, very glad I had them on my shelf, and I'm very, very glad that these were the first real romance novels that I ever read, because the romance novel that I read after these 3 books was so genuinely horribly bad that had that been my first experience with romance at a genre, I would never have read another romance book again. And that book is The Love Freaking Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. I made a very long, very ranty review of The Love Hypothesis that I'm going to link up in the cards right now. The Love Hypothesis was the only book that I rated 2.5 stars in the entirety of 2021, which means that it was the worst book that I read in the year 2021. The only other thing I want to say about The Love Hypothesis, which I did not mention in that review, but I feel like it is really important for me to say, I did not hate The Love Hypothesis because it was problematic. I know I spent a lot of time in that review talking about the problematic aspects of it, mostly because I was really annoyed at the author trying to pretend like it wasn't problematic, but I consume plenty of problematic media and art that I still manage to think very highly of and enjoy, because I am perfectly capable of acknowledging that a thing is problematic and still having a good fucking time. My problem with the love hypothesis is not only that it was problematic, the real crime that the love hypothesis committed, in my personal opinion, is that it was boring and awkward. That's really it. I did not have an iconic time reading the book. Even when I like sat down to binge read it in one sitting, the highs that I felt were never really that high. Because I will totally forgive a piece of literature that has like completely garbage problematic elements if at other points in the story I was like, wow, I'm having such a great time, this is such a fun read, this is flying by. And that was not my experience of reading The Love Hypothesis. To me, The Love Hypothesis was just like a thoroughly mediocre book, and mediocre books get 2.5 out of 5. 50%, right down the middle. Luckily for me, the book that I read immediately after The Love Hypothesis was The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. Now, this is not the copy of The Song of Achilles that I read. I actually checked the book out from the library, but I love this book so much, and I rated it 5 stars, and I could not stop talking about it to my friends, so much so that during my birthday this past month, one of my lovely friends all the way from Singapore ended up ordering this book for me as a birthday present. The cover is absolutely stunning, even the end pages are beautiful, and I'm just like, I'm so incredibly grateful to my friend for having gotten this book for me, because I know for a fact that I'm going to want to reread this book. I gave it 5 stars, like it means that it's a book that I definitely want to revisit, and which kind of like knocked my socks off. And this copy is just so beautiful and precious to me because it was a birthday gift, and I'm just like, I'm so eternally grateful. But let me actually talk about the book itself and why I kind of rated it 5 stars. It's the retelling of the stories of Achilles and Patroclus from the Iliad. Now, I heard about this novel because I saw a lot of people crying about it on TikTok. And I'm gonna be honest with you, I behaved in a very like dismissive and boomer-like fashion when I saw that, because my immediate reaction was like, why are you crying? Have you never heard of the Iliad? Like, do you not know the story of Achilles and like how it ends? When I finally get to reading this book, and I will read this book because it's gay and I'm gay, I'm definitely not going to cry because I'm different. Lads, I was not different. I cried like a little baby despite my big age and the fact that I knew exactly what was going to happen. As a matter of fact, the situational irony of it all, the fact that I knew exactly what was going to happen, made the experience of reading it just, it made me want to like tear my hair out, but in the best way possible. It was like watching a train in the distance about to crash and knowing that you're like too far away and powerless to stop it. The prose has this sort of like ode-like, mythic, poetic feel to it. Madeline Miller uses a lot of like metaphors and descriptions that are ripped right out of like Homeric text, like swift-footed Achilles, for example. There are a lot of like internal rhymes and sentences. There's a lot of like alliteration. And she does this thing where she writes like really long sentences with lots of like commas and clauses, and then follows it up by like a really, really short sentence. And it ends up creating like a very sort of distinct rhythm to her writing, which ends up making the prose kind of feel like poetry. Like, the characterization is also just bonkers good. Like, I am obsessed with all of the women in these stories. Achilles' mom, Thetis, is quite possibly maybe like my favorite character in this entire novel. She's such a difficult and complex and complicated woman. She is so thoroughly unlikable, and the rage that she has, it just like, it leaps off of the page right at you. And like, for the first time in my life, I became like acutely aware of just how many women were present all throughout the Iliad, but kind of like ignored in the primary narrative of the story because Homer was focusing on like all of these male heroes. This book was so good, it put me back in my Greek mythology phase, guys. Like, I'm about to read the Iliad and the Odyssey now because of the Song of Achilles. I also want to read like The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker and 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes. Oh, and the themes in this book, bonkers. There are so many. Like, you can look at this book from the perspective of like gender and women and misogyny. You can also trace the theme of honor. You can trace the theme of memory. Like, how do you want to be remembered? For what? Like, what is your legacy like once you are gone? You can probably even do like an interesting like post-colonial reading of this, because at one point Madeline Miller is like, hey, if the ships that the Greeks are on get burnt up by the Trojans, they go from being an attacking army to literally being like refugees who must now rely on the Trojans for like food and aid and survival. And so there's just like, there's so much going on. This is a really, really rich book. It is a really, really well-written book. I think if you have even a vague interest in Greek mythology, you will thoroughly enjoy it. If you don't give a fuck about Greek mythology, I don't actually know how good of a time you're gonna have. So the next book I have, The Scum Villain Self-Saving System Volume 1. I just realized I own a physical copy of the book, but it's too far away and my battery is rapidly dwindling, so I'm not gonna go get it. I rated this book 4 stars, and I'm not gonna talk about this book here because I'm literally in the middle of like planning out a full-blown dedicated review to Scum Villain Self-Saving System. Not just Volume 1, the physical copy that I own, but the entire story. So that video should be out either like this upcoming week or the week after, like definitely within the next 10 days or so. So if you're interested in ancient Chinese gay people, or you just want to hear me like lose my mind, keep an eye out for that video because that book lives rent-free inside my head. I can't stop thinking about it, I can't stop talking about it, and part of it is a rave, but a big part of it is also like a rant, and there's just so much going on, so keep an eye out for that vid. I'm gonna move on to the final book of the year that I finished literally as the clock was like running down on December 31st. It is Normal People by Sally Rooney. I am rapidly losing both daylight and battery charge, so I'm just gonna be quick about this novel. I didn't like it. I actually only rated this 3 stars. This was probably in like the bottom 10 books that I read in 2021. Dude, I have like ADHD, and Sally Rooney's insistence on not using quotation marks when discussing dialogue, it actually kind of became like an accessibility issue for me, and I ended up DNFing the book twice until I was able to get the audiobook from the library and able to like listen along while I read so that I could like properly delineate like the dialogue going on in this novel. So I think that also like really dampened my experience of reading this novel, but also like I just like did not care about Connell and Marianne that much. I was not invested in their story. I didn't really care about them that much at all. I don't understand the hype around this book. I'm so sorry. If you have read Sally Rooney's books, can you please tell me like what your thoughts are on her novels? Like what do you like about them? What do you dislike about them? What are your favorites? Like what draws you to her fiction? Because honestly, like I don't see it. I am not here for it because the way that people are written in this novel, it's dry as fuck. Like I don't care about any of these folks. But I know I'm definitely in the minority and I'm probably gonna get canceled for my opinions, but I gotta stand in my truth. I don't have the battery charge to try and waffle about this. I didn't like this book. I thought it was mediocre at best. It was not worth the hype, and I need somebody to explain this to me because maybe I'm just a dumbass. And with that, that's everything. I have finally reviewed all 52 books that I read in 2021. If you have made it all the way to the end of this like bonkers long 2-part video, thank you so much for watching. And as always, I hope you have an amazing upcoming week. And even if the rest of your week is not that amazing, that's okay. Take care of yourselves. Bye!